Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. In today's video we're gonna see how I painted this Imperial Fists Space Marine. This video is part of a series where I'm gonna show you my take on all the major chapters of Space Marine. The color list for this video, you can take notes if you'd like to follow along. The Space Marine was almost fully assembled, base coated with Vallejo black primer with the airbrush. I started working on the model from the armor. I laid down a base coat with autumn green from scale 75 color. I took reference from a picture that I found in Imperial Fist Codex, Sentinels of Terra. I really like the cold yellow tones that you see in that art piece, and I wanted to imitate it. Browsing online, you can find many tutorials that are going to show you how you can paint and achieve a warm yellow look, typical of the Games Workshop publications for the Imperial Fist chapter. My take is, however, a little bit different. I decided to go for a colder tone, which means that all the yellows are gonna shift towards the blue and the green side rather than the red side. Though painting yellow over black is not recommended, with the airbrush and with the application of many thin coats, I was able to achieve a solid look, and I really took advantage of the shadows that the black foundation underneath would leave. So when you apply a base coat on a model, your main goal is to preserve the surface. You need to have a solid color and you need to have a smooth surface. With the airbrush this is easy, this is why I'm doing this with this tool, but it could be done with the brush. After that I moved on to the first shade using Field Gray from scale 75. I also put some other colors on the palette, taking into consideration the idea of mixing them a little bit, but I just ended up using Field Gray for the shadow colors without mixing it with any other of the scale colors. You can see how I applied it. I tried to achieve a look of a reflective armor, so I wanted to simulate a shining yellow. Since I'm trying to get the shiny look on this yellow, I need to place the lights and shadow in a position where they would match the real object illuminated from above. This is something that I'm still learning, that I'm still trying to improve on, so I am just placing the shadows in this stage. I'm not doing a smooth blending or a refined job. I am just positioning them on the model to verify that my decisions on where they land is correct. For the first highlight color, my choice was to use a My Mary Artistic Grade Brera Line color. It's a very cold and very saturated yellow that I really enjoyed using on this model. You can see that it's not warming the tones up, but is leaving them on the right side of the color wheel. Even in this stage, I didn't particularly care about the precision of the transitions between the colors, but just with the light placement on the model. However, it is really important to preserve the surface even in these layers. So you need to apply thin coats and the paint needs to be thin. It's particularly important when you're using acrylic grade paints, especially if they are heavy body. With the idea of bringing the attention of the viewer to the higher part of the model, so the torso and the head, I applied larger highlights on these areas of the miniature. After this first highlight application was finished, I moved on to a second highlight, adding white to the palette, mixed the Brera yellow with white and a bit of autumn green from scale 75 to get my second highlight tone. It's a very pale color that I applied in thin coats within the first highlight. This is all done in order to get that three-dimensional effect from the model. We need to exaggerate, we need to amplify the volumes of the model with the colors and with the different tones. As you can see from the images, the model at the moment doesn't look smooth, doesn't look finished. It's a rough sketch of the lights and shadows on the armor. I'm not taking into consideration the smaller details of this part as well. I am just taking into consideration the bigger shapes and the general volumes. Once again, with the idea of bringing the viewer attentions to the upper part of the model, the highlights were wider in this section of the miniature. So compared to the legs, you can see a lot more light on the head, on the shoulders, and on the neck. The model is starting to take shape and it's time to apply a second, deeper shade. I did that by adding dark sea blue to the palette, mixing it with field gray, generating a very dark greenish bluish color that I applied within the first shadow. Throughout all this process, I'm not taking into account the smaller details. I am not trying to blend these colors at all. I am just placing them on the model in order to judge the volumes. The only care that I am taking is to preserve the surface. So the colors are all thinned down, they are applied in thin layers, and the surface is kept as smooth as possible. Always wait for a layer to dry before touching it again. Another way to create contrast on the model is to change the temperature of one area compared to the other. So I decided to go for a warm yellow glaze on the higher part of the model and in general on all those volumes that I found would have catch more light. This will create a different type of contrast, not just dark and light, but also a hue shift from cold to warm within the yellow range. The application of this glaze is not bound to the previous stages. I am not working within the constraints of the highlighted and shaded areas painted before. We are talking about a glaze that goes over both shadows and highlights of different parts of the models. In specific, all those parts that are exposed to the most light. And here is how the model looked when I finished painting all the lights and shadows and applied the first glaze of the warm tones. The contrast is there. Now it's time to blend all the colors and all the transitions to achieve the clean look that I want in the end. So to blend these tones, I use the base color and shift it a little bit towards the shadow or the light, mixing it with the different colors. And I place it in between all the different layers, blending it, smoothing them out. You need to thin the paint a little bit more so that you can work with the transparent characteristics of acrylic paints. The layer needs to be, in fact, not fully opaque, but transparent. You apply a brush stroke going from one direction to the center of the transition. So from highlight towards the shadow, stopping in the middle, and the other way around. So from the shadow to the highlight, stopping in the middle of the transition. These will blend the tones together and little by little changing the surface that you touch with this method, reducing it, you will create a smooth blending. This is by far the longest step of all the painting process. It takes time. You need to apply a thin layer and wait for it to be completely dried before touching the area again. This is very important and time consuming. If you don't follow this rule and become impatient touching the paint while it's drying, you will move it around, making the surface rough, texturized, and will make further blending very difficult. Overall, throughout this process, keep on mixing tones to pick up with the brush that are in between the two that you're trying to blend together. This will make the process easier. Once the blending is done, to get a better definition of the model, I like to block out with black all those areas that are not gonna be yellow in the end. So this is what I'm doing right now, and the only care that you need to take while applying this black color is to not to ruin the parts that you've painted so far. If you happen to touch a spot, just go back to some of the yellow that you've used and cover it up. Now that the armor is finished, I focus my attention on the minor details on the miniature. Using fire red, I applied a base coat on those areas that would be red in the end. So the chest eagle and the shoulder trims, also the bolters, were painted with red. No big secret, it's just a solid layer, and you need to apply about 2 coats to get a good coverage. Once the red base coat was dried, I thinned down some dark sea blue and I washed it over the red areas to get a strong visual definition of these parts. Also, I used this color, very thin down, to paint a line that would define and separate the yellow parts and the red parts. I mixed some of the Brera yellow with the red to get a highlight color. This highlight color was then applied on the top of the shoulder pads and on all the feathers of the chest eagle. Also, the bolter was highlighted and received the same treatment. In general, when the areas are so small, there is really no need to blend the colors together. You just need to pick a correct tone and apply it with precision where it needs to go. Like, for instance, at the end of every single feather on this chest eagle. I know that painting something this small can be difficult and challenging. The trick to me is to keep on moving the model around so that you can better access the area that you're trying to touch with the brush. And here is what I've done so far. You can see all the yellow tones blended, you can see the red painted, and you can see what's still left undone. So now we're moving on to painting the metal parts of this model. When I paint the metal, I always change the palette. I switch to a regular one, not a wet palette, and I change the brushes and water parts. I don't want the metallic flakes containing the acrylic metallic paints to mix with the rest of the colors. The first color that I applied on the metallic areas is Gun Grey from Vallejo Modelaire. I really like this color, and I think it's very good quality when it comes to metallic paints. Like I said for the red, even in this case, the only care that you need to take is to not spill over. So try to keep the brush tip sharp and apply the color just in those areas that you need to paint with the metallic colors. However, if you do a mistake and paint it over, the best advice would be to cover the mistake portion with black paint and then paint it over with some yellow. Even if it's gonna take a couple of layers, this is the only way that you can be sure the metallic paint is not gonna show through the colored layers. To get a better definition of all the metallic areas and to shade them a little bit, I like to use a black ink. I thin it a little bit and just wash it over the metallic areas painted before. This gives an instant definition to all the edges and all the corners, and I really like the look that it gives in the end. And I use an ink and not a shade because I like that satin effect that I get in the end. I like the shine that the inks have when it comes to metallic areas. I used aluminum for a highlight color. I thin it down and applied as I would do with any other acrylic paint. I just touched all the higher corners and all the edges with it. To quickly blend together the metallic colors, I use this technique. I basically paint the highlight with little paint in the brush, and I keep on going, painting new areas until the reservoir of the brush bristle it's almost empty. And when it's almost empty, I go back to the first area where I painted the highlight that would be dry at that point and run the brush like if I was dry brushing over the transition. This would give me an instant blend that it's more than enough for such small areas of metallic colors. If the area was wider or bigger, then I would work in exactly the same way that I had with the yellow armor, for instance. With the metallic parts painted, I mixed a darker tone with dark sea blue and black to paint all the pouches and joints of the Space Marine. I wanted to keep them dark and cold, so the decision for these tones was ideal. And this is done because I don't want to distract the viewer attention. When they first look at the model, I don't want their eyes to be drawn to the pouches or the belts or the joints. They need to be basically background noise. They need to be there, and only in a second moment, when they really pay attention to the model as a whole, be taken into consideration. To give more definition to these details, I mixed in a lighter tone, adding autumn green to the base color applied before, painting edge highlights on the rubber joints and painting highlights over the pouches. Adding the same color used for the armor to highlight these tones helps bonding the model all together, not getting outside of the cold hue that we have achieved so far. The model is almost done. It's now time to paint the base. I applied a wash with dark armor brown, and then I moved on to pigments. I started out using Secret Weapon violet pigments. I just thinned them down with water and spread them unevenly onto the base. Violet is a complementary color to the yellow that we're using, so it really gives a nice contrast to the look of the miniature. As you can see, I'm painting over the feet and the shins of the armor. This is because I want to integrate the model with the ground, with the base. You don't want it to be like floating over the ruins. You want it to be there. I'm also adding some light earth pigments from Forge World and randomly spreading over the base to create more variation. Once they're dried, I pick light sea gray from Vallejo Modeler and painted some minor details over the base. You can see all these stone-like details or concrete details, and painting them with a gentle wash so that they keep a very warm look. With the base complete, it was time to add some special effects to the model. What I'm trying to improve on is creating these very interesting and unusual spots of extreme saturation and fluorescence on the miniature. So I've mixed laser red from all the Forge Monkey Day Glow Pigments line with some glazing medium, and I started applying it in the eyes and on the rifle lenses. It's still a challenge to paint these tones correctly, and still a learning curve, but I really like the result that I got with this model. You will see in a little bit. For the chapter symbol, I decided to use a decal. I had them lying around, so I felt like after 20 years it was probably time to use them and see how they worked. Painting the shoulder pad with hard coat, so a very glossy varnish, will help the decal stick to the surface. Because the surface is also very round, it could be helpful to cut the decal into two sections. And once everything is dried, let me on medium to cover and get rid of the shining of the hard coat. And here you have the final result. I'm very curious to know your opinion, so please let me know in the comments what you think of these techniques, what you think of my way of showing you what I'm doing, and of my special effects. Thank you for sticking around for so long. Once again, the colors that I've used for this painting process, and if you did enjoy, like and subscribe. See you next time.